Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 85. And this time we're going to talk about the Dave Brubeck Quartet's 1985 album, Jazz Impressions of New York. So, what to expect? Well, basically it's Dave Brubeck, which means a number of things. You're going to get a mixture of cool jazz, you get a little bit of bop, you get, and because it's the 1960s, you get a little bit of bossa nova as well, you get a little bit of Broadway, because Dave was always trying to extend his reach and extend his composing styles. You've got polyrhythmic compositions where you've got apparently competing rhythm figures that aren't actually competing. And you've got the undeniable talents, not just of Brubeck, but really overwhelmingly of Paul Desmond, who for me is the primary reason to listen to Dave Brubeck records. This is the classic lineup of Eugene Wright, Joe Morello, Dave Brubeck, and Paul Desmond. And this album is produced by one of Columbia's main in-house producers in the 1960s, Teo Macero. This is an unusual and slightly interesting album in that Brubeck had been commissioned by CBS to write music for a TV series which only lasted one season called Mr. Broadway, which starred a guy called Craig Stevens as the lead character Mike Bell in the role of a public relations specialist in New York. Brubeck's brief was to produce music which was urbane and sophisticated, but also to have music which was unmistakably Brubeck, because ever since Time Out, Brubeck and the sound of Desmond's saxophone has been associated with cool, modern jazz, and that was the association the producers were trying to access. So a little bit about Dave Brubeck. He, of course, didn't want to be a professional musician. He grew up in a ranch. He wanted to be a rancher and then changed, based on his parents' advice to get a proper career, to wanting to become a veterinarian. He goes to the College of the Pacific, is looking out the window daydreaming. His instructors realize his heart is in jazz, and he switches to become a music major and takes really a rather formal and thorough education in music over the coming years. He starts playing in and around San Francisco. In 1947, he meets Paul Desmond, the alto saxophonist who would play such a major part in his career. In 1949, Desmond starts up a band in Palo Alto, California, so Brubeck leaves his current gig, goes to join that band. Desmond leaves after several weeks, so Brubeck's a bit cheesed. He starts up his own group. It's a trio. He doesn't include a saxophone, although Desmond is the best saxophonist he knows because he's still annoyed. Eventually, however, Desmond keeps sitting in, and they invite Desmond in, and the trio becomes a quartet. Originally not with Eugene Wright and Joe Morello, but with Joe Dodge and Bob Bates. Towards the end of the 1950s, Bates is out, Dodge is out, and in come Wright and Morello, and the classic quartet is formed in time for Time Out, which of course comes out in 1959, which is the album reviewed elsewhere on this channel, which has all the different time signatures, and which really made a huge splash in the jazz world. And of course, famously, Brubeck makes the cover of Time before people like Louis Armstrong, or Dizzy Gillespie, or Duke Ellington, or any of the other major long-standing figures of jazz, the first jazz player to actually make the cover of Time, which was a sore point for a lot of people, although Ellington was quite gracious about it. But leaving that injustice aside, what Time Out did was open the door for Brubeck really to fulfill whatever musical aspirations he wanted to fulfill. So he wanted to compose for the ballet, he did. He wanted to write songs for Broadway, he did. He wanted to do bossa nova. Mind you, so did everybody in the early 1960s. He also took the opportunity to become the spearhead of a PR campaign by the US State Department of essentially exporting American culture overseas, and so his quartet toured extensively across the globe, and several of the albums that he produced in the early 1960s chronicle that particular aspect of their career. It was even said at one point that when the Americans had messed up some aspect of their foreign relations, they'd send the Brubeck Quartet in to repair the damage. Funny story, but also reflecting the degree to which Brubeck was seen to be, and was to a degree, in with the establishment and the authorities when jazz, for the most part, and particularly jazz not played by white jazz musicians but by black jazz musicians in the 1960s, was the music of protest. Brubeck was very much in with the establishment, for better or worse. Well, as I mentioned, it's composed for a TV show. There are requirements of the composer when doing something like that to convey certain kinds of moods, whether they be fast-paced, slow-paced, romantic, foreboding, and so on. And so you get a little bit of that here. Although I wouldn't say that you would necessarily guess this were for a TV show if you didn't otherwise know. Anyway, It starts off with a tune called Theme from Mr. Broadway, unsurprisingly, which has this kind of urgent polyrhythmic feel of a lot of his other adventures, particularly in 3/4 time. It's a great Brubeckian tune. It is meant to evoke the hustle and bustle of Broadway and of New York City life in the 1960s. I think it does that very effectively. Not that I lived in New York in the 1960s, but one can imagine. Then you're into a change of pace, a bossa nova tune called Broadway Bossa Nova. Now this is not the most convincing bossa nova rhythm. I mean, the Brubeck Quartet were, along with a lot of other jazz players, kind of bossa nova pretenders, never really got to grips with it the same way that, say, Stan Getz did. But I will say that this song is rescued by Paul Desmond, as so often songs by Brubeck are rescued by Paul Desmond. And Brubeck himself has a nice light touch in his solo, which was not always the case because he often sort of pounds out the block chords to excess, I think. Then we have the third change of pace here, a third different mood, and this is a really lovely song. It's called Autumn in Washington Square. And I think you can make a good case this might be the strongest song on the whole album. It's in 3/4, it's a beautiful jazz waltz. The waltz doesn't actually emerge until there's been a little intro by Brubeck, and then you get into this airy solo from Desmond, which just totally transports me. Anyway, I think this is a wonderful tune. It's one of Brubeck's best tunes. And that's followed by an up-tempo bop tune called Something to Sing About. Really an excuse for Dave and Paul to exchange solos. It's a cheerful little tune, nothing particularly major going on here. And that gives way to an unusually long tune, nearly 7 minutes, well, for Brubeck anyway, called Sixth Sense. This is a slow blues, but played in a kind of a cool jazz manner. I actually really kind of like this tune. A large part of the melody has Desmond and Brubeck essentially playing whole notes in unison, which is, again, a little unusual. I think the song kind of runs out of gas by about the 5-minute mark. Perhaps they had their reasons for going on longer. They wanted more music to be able to mine for the TV show, who knows. Anyway, interesting tune. The side closes out with Spring in Central Park, which is kind of a frenetic song with some rapid passages played by both Paul and Dave. This is, I think, a little bit forgettable, but still, on the whole, a strong side of music, particularly some wonderful soloing by Desmond. We get to side 2, we start off with a song called Lonely Mr. Broadway, which is basically an excuse for a long extended solo by Desmond, and I could listen to that all day long. He's written off sometimes as cocktail music. I think that's pretty unfair. I think what he gets tonally is really rare and really pretty magical. Then we have Summer on the Sound, which starts off with this nice little piece of brushwork by Morello on the drums. Then we have Dave and Paul exchanging solos. And what Dave says in the liner notes is a song written in 3/4. I'm convinced, after having been schooled by a friend of mine on Facebook the other day about time signatures, this is actually in 12/8. So anyway, if anybody knows more about this particular song, feel free to note that in the comments. And then another song in 3/4 time called Winter Ballad, a nice little Desmond-led waltz again. Pretty nice, nothing too memorable. And then a song called Broadway Romance, which has more beautiful playing, both from Desmond and from Brubeck. Nothing too challenging, but just really quite a lovely song. The album closes out with a song called Broadway Rumba. This is, well, I don't know, it's a bit of a hot mess of a tune. The liner notes are quite extensive about the process that went into the creation of this song, which apparently consisted of different people showing up in the studio with instruments that they weren't actually typically known to play. And so you had Desmond coming out with a marimba, a friend of the drummers is playing on the tom-toms, the producer's playing instruments. On top of all this, you've got Dave laying down some of those block chords he was so fond of. I think this was a group that needed to fill out the album and had enough material for the TV show, and were largely just having fun. So as I say, it's a bit of a mess. Nothing you really want to necessarily go back to. Well, when you're talking about Brubeck, there are people who take Brubeck seriously, and then there are those for whom Brubeck is only a minor player, was essentially that kind of establishment-friendly lightweight who produced a lot of schlock in their views. There's a little bit of substance to that second school of thought, but I think on the whole, he and his group don't necessarily get the credit they deserve. This album is not normally very well reviewed at all if you look online. I don't think it's a masterpiece, but I think it's underrated. Brubeck is never going to be challenging, but he has a wonderful ear and mind for composition. He's always got Desmond to bail the band out of anything which seems particularly heavy-handed. And together, they create some things of real beauty, particularly that song Autumn in Washington Square, which if you only listen to that one and seek it out, you'll be rewarded for sure. The limitations of the group are sometimes on display in their albums, and that's the case here as well. What you really have here are two, maybe two and a half virtuosos out of four players. Wright is just a steady stay-at-home bassist. You wouldn't necessarily call Morello a stay-at-home drummer, but you don't get much flash from him normally on the Brubeck records, and there's very little on here. So it's left to Brubeck and Desmond to carry the day. Desmond always shines. Brubeck is inconsistent, and that kind of gives you the flavor of how this record goes. So I give this 3.5 stars. If you're a Brubeck fan, it's worth spinning. If you're not a Brubeck fan but you love jazz, then I think at least a few of the tunes on the first side are worth listening to.